today against the backdrop of international condemnation and calls for inquiry over the death of Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh and the aftermath, most notably the events during her funeral. We ask, is international condemnation effective at all? Let's take a closer look and pick up the debate right after.
A deeply distressing scene at a ceremony intended for mourning, as violent clashes erupted at the funeral for Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh. Scenes of Israeli police rushing participants using force have triggered widespread international condemnation. Pushing back against a barrage of criticism, the Israeli police said in a subsequent statement that it intervened outside the hospital because rioters had seized the casket against the wishes of the family. But Abu Akleh's brother told the BBC that mourners were bombarded by officers as they left the hospital. The causes of the clashes still remains unclear, but several reported the throwing of objects and stones. Israel's police are set to investigate the cause of the clashes, and the UN has denounced the incident, calling for a fair and impartial investigation. Both the US and the EU have also spoken out against the incident, calling the scenes deeply disturbing. But will Israel's internal investigation lead to accountability? And will the words of global leaders make a difference? How effective is international condemnation?
So let's get to it. How effective is international condemnation? My dear panelists, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate right after. So, Gerard, take the lead.
Well, thank you so much for having me. International condemnation is meaningless when it is biased and one-sided, which is something we've seen repeatedly directed towards Israel and the Jewish community. There wasn't international condemnation in the recent wave of attacks that has seen 19 Israelis killed, 3 Jews hacked to death, and globalized violence against Jews. International condemnation is only effective when it is properly directed and channeled at an actual cause, and that is not something we're seeing today. We're seeing a distorted narrative that's been hijacked by evildoers to fit their narrow propaganda purposes.
Yeah, Gerard, thank you very much for this. Signon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me too. I think that already the IDF started investigating itself and showing responsibility and taking the lead in verifying, clarifying what are the reasons and who shot. And I think that international condemnation as well as international interference in our conflict is very not effective and productive for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And while Shireen Abu Akleh was a beloved figure, she was...
Yes, Inan, we will put a stop right there and pick up the debate shortly. Last but not least, Isabella, your take?
Thank you for having me. So in this story, of course, there's 3 sides: the Palestinian side, the Israeli side, and the truth. And when it comes to international condemnation, the truth is often not what's important or what is, deemed as or holds where it should be important. And that's where the bad faith comes in. So international condemnation is, holds weight when it's rooted in good faith. But we see that those who point to Israel and to blame the death on Israel omit a lot of facts, like what the Palestinian Authority's doctor said, and the video footage. So when it's not rooted in good faith, I don't see how international condemnation could be effective.
Okay, so dear panelists, please feel free to interact with one another. And I would like to begin with this change of heart we've seen on the Palestinian side when we're talking about the investigation into the death of Abu Akleh. We'll talk about the funeral a bit later. At the beginning, they say they do not want any intervention. Yesterday, they're saying yes to international involvement, no to Israeli involvement. What do you make of this, Gerard?
Well, I think it's promising that they're actually refusing to help assess the bullet and the evidence. This is something that was a sticking point from the beginning and quite spectacular in their denial of providing resources to get to a full and fair investigation of what happened. But it also shows bias. You have the Israeli government, which is obligated to investigate this, as this is where the incident occurred under the jurisdiction of the Israeli government. And you see a blatant attempt by the Palestinian Authority to manipulate international opinion and to make this an international issue when in fact it isn't. So they're playing gamesmanship with evidence, with something that should be independently reviewed but that independent review exists, the capacity exists. This is something that has been investigated in the past by the Israeli law enforcement authorities and can be adequately done so without involving the international community. So this is a false flag. It's a false narrative to involve international efforts when this is something that can and has been handled locally in the past.
Inon, what's your take?
The Palestinians have their own narrative, and especially the official Palestinian narrative that says that this was assassination, therefore needs to be investigated as targeted, as if the IDF targeted Shireen Abu Akleh, rest in peace. This doesn't make sense, and Al Jazeera, which is clearly anti-Israeli, that is also related and identified with Hamas, work tightly with the IDF. So the IDF doesn't have an interest to kill her. On the contrary, it actually put Israel in a very problematic place. Because the war today is war on consciousness.
But in this respect, Inon and dear panelists, we are seeing Israel constantly reluctant to cooperate with international inquiries as such. Why is it? Why is Israel afraid to an extent to cooperate?
I don't think that Israel is afraid to cooperate. I think that Israel is doing the right thing by checking the facts. And as the IDF Chief of Staff, Aviv Kochavi, last week had the discussion about, to clarify the truth and say that there might be a possibility that it was the IDF. I think it's an inner Israeli, something that should belong here in this land, and Israel should take responsibility if indeed it was Israel. But international community will always be diverted against Israel, so therefore it's not a fair game in the first place.
But how effective can police investigating itself can be? Like, what did the results of such an inquiry actually be, Gerard?
Well, we've seen this in countless instances, not just in Israel, but across the world. It's not the police investigating itself, but there are bureaus and divisions that specialize in holding the police accountable. They exist in Israel as they do everywhere else. And quite frankly, this has been put to good use by many other countries in the world, including Israel. So it's sort of a distorted narrative to say we don't trust the police to investigate a crime, even when, or a potential crime, even when the alleged perpetrators are police officers. We need to get to the bottom of investigations. And we have impartial investigations carried out effectively by police every day all over the world. This case is no different. The only reason we're seeing it different is the lawfare against the Israeli government, against the Jewish people, by trying to introduce the specter of international law, which simply does not apply to something that happened within the borders and something that happened within Israel. This is an attempt to politicize the issue, and that is what we need to avoid. We need to not allow this to be hijacked for nefarious purposes for a political agenda.
But Isabel, it's been a long-standing debate here in Jerusalem whether to cooperate or not to cooperate with such international investigations, multiple instances in the past, especially when it comes to the ICC. And my question to you is this: what does Israel have to quote unquote gain from cooperation? Maybe it is better off just staying out, investigating itself.
Well, first of all, I don't think Israel really has anything to hide. Israel is investigating for itself for its own reasons, and we've seen that Israel has not been reluctant to conduct investigations, whether it was on the highest levels with, Bibi or Ehud Olmert. Israel has conducted investigations, and its judiciary has held people and entities accountable when it is time. I think Israelis and Israel have the right to feel, a sense of maybe disdain towards the international community, partially because of the disproportionate votes against Israel in the United Nations General Assembly. There is a continualized institutional bias against Israel. But what does Israel have to gain? Well, Israel is a member state, and I think it's important to mention that Israel was built in accordance to international law. And that's a key element here, that Israel has never been afraid. And I don't think Israel is afraid, to your previous question.
And before we're nearing the end of this part of the debate, what can we actually expect from one-sided investigations? Let it be the Palestinians wanting to investigate the death on their own, and Israeli police wanting to investigate the funeral clashes on its own. Can it really bear any substantial or productive fruit? Inon.
I think that, again, it's a question of narrative. I don't think that the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian officials will want to get to the facts. It's more about narrative. I more trust about the IDF for doing the research and seeing exactly what happened. And I don't have expectations, actually, from the facts from the other side, unfortunately, not in the official way.
Gerard, your thoughts?
In many ways, these discussions prejudice the ability of an investigation to be carried out, in the sense there's no assertion here. There's no basis to say that the investigation has or would be anything other than impartial and proper. We're trying to make a political statement about Israel and about the Jewish community instead of focusing on the facts and investigating the case. If after an investigation is concluded there are issues, that should obviously be transparent so we can examine how the investigation took place. But we're already saying now that an investigation can't be trusted, even though there's no reason to do that. And one other quick point, Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court lacks jurisdiction. So this whole discussion of involving the international community is also a biased attempt to intervene in a situation where there's no basis to do so.
And to that point, exactly. To an extent, maybe international involvement in this case is counterproductive, as in hindering any progress between the two sides. Perhaps echoing what Inon mentioned in his opening remarks. Isabella?
In some way,
yeah.
Please.
Well, speaking of investigations, what better way to hold an investigation than between the Palestinian Authority and Israel? Israel had offered the Palestinian Authority a joint investigation. They declined. So that raises questions as to why they declined, or why Shirin Abu Akleh's body was buried so quickly, or why the bullet wasn't investigated. I really am a strong believer in Palestinian and Israelis working together. So when it comes to international community involvement, we have seen time and time again that there is a clear institutionalized bias, especially at the United Nations. I personally wish that the PA would have accepted this joint investigation, because what a better way to hold each other accountable.
Gerard, you wanted to comment?
No, I completely agree. I think that's an excellent point. The investigation was offered from the very beginning to involve the Palestinian authorities, but this was declined. So this is political grandstanding. It's nothing more than that. It's that pure and simple. And in terms of international cooperation, I also wanted to point out, involving the international community is adverse to maintaining and developing a peace agreement between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. It's imposing a settlement or a structure that needs to be reached freely and fully by the people involved in it. So saying that the International Criminal Court or the UN will come in and somehow impose its verdict, its decision, its opinion, its jurisdiction is detrimental to peace, and it has nothing to foster it.
And my question to you, are international bodies immune to public opinion, or more accurately, should they be? Isabella, what do you think?
I think absolutely international bodies should not be immune to public opinion. And just like any other body that has a decision-making capability like the UN General Assembly, it's important that we hold them accountable, because for example, the General Assembly, it's the interests of states that are being voted on. Or let's say it's the ICC, no one is, or no body should be exempt from, scrutiny, and that's what brings about impartiality when everyone has, eyes on it, especially when it comes to an international body.
Inon, what are your thoughts?
I agree with Isabella. I think that what's happening in the international arena is from the get-go is biased against Israel, and basically that's what I think.
But you know what? Maybe perhaps to make the debate with the other examples, let's take Russia and Ukraine, for example. Is a third-party international investigation can be politics-free, or should be politics-free, Gerard?
International investigation should be politics-free, but unfortunately that's not the case. And we have had decades of experience with anti-Israel and anti-Jewish forces in the international community swaying these bodies. We have more resolutions against Israel than against any other country. And this shows an inherent bias, a systemic bias against the Jewish community internationally and the state of Israel in particular. So this should be beyond politics, but unfortunately it's not. We aspire to have ideals, but we've allowed people to sway these bodies to the point that they've become ineffective, because they're biased, and they perpetuate the cycle of violence instead of stopping it.
So what should Israel's policy be? Should it give up in advance, so to speak, and say, well, when it comes to the international court or the international public opinion, we're just sitting this one out because it appears to be there appears to be no way to win it,
I want to try to speak about something different regarding that matter. I think that instead of us trying to say to the world how good we are and all that, I think that we need to take responsibility over our land and start to have discussions, real discussion with Palestinians, not the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian people, and start to create something here that will not, put us in a place of every time being under the blaming finger of the international community.
Yeah, obviously, there's no way out of any real progress on the ground in this respect. But Gerard, what do you think Israel's policy should be in this respect? Not to even try and engage in the global game?
It's not about engagement. Israel has and always will engage in the global game. It's about making sure that the game isn't rigged. It's about making sure that Israel follows what the law, international law, is as it's understood and as it has done, without falling for fake pressure to join bodies like the International Criminal Court, which don't have jurisdiction and should not be involved in this. I think Israel also needs to, denormalize the Jew hatred that occurs in these institutions. We need to point out that it's not, we have an intifada in word, if not in physical presence now, in which terrorist attacks are attacking Israelis and Jews on a daily basis. Whether it's in Israel or in New York City or in London or in Los Angeles, we have people calling for violence against Jews. And this is a global phenomenon that feeds on itself. We need, the state of Israel needs, it's the leader in setting forth the policy on what is good for the Jewish people in Israel and for Israel itself. But we need more leadership in calling out this bias and in fighting the systemic Jew hatred that's taken over institutions like the United Nations.
So, Isabella, what do you think is the right policy here from Israel's standpoint?
I think it should be broken down somewhere that's a little bit more nuanced, like case by case, whether it's in international bodies like the United Nations or even NGOs. Let's take, for example, an extreme example of a biased NGO like Human Rights Watch. The leader of this organization, Ken Roth, has proved time and time again to have a systemic bias against Israel, and his reports are also rooted in, most of the time, misinformation. So when it comes to engaging with the international community, I think two things need to be really looked at. Number one would be funding. Where is the money coming from when it comes to an NGO? And when it comes to international bodies, I think it would have to do with a lot of it is bias and who's leading the inquiry. And we see that a lot of times those who are leading the inquiry have history of anti-Israel activism, or alleged activism, if you can call it that. So I think it should be broken down, and Israel should, of course, be open to being, an active member in the international community, as it is in so many other respects, leading in technology and so many other beautiful ways that Israel brings light onto the world.
And Gerard, I would like to echo part of your earlier remarks. What teeth such a potential investigation can have, or simply put, can international law be enforced on the ground?
Honestly, not really. It's a nice thing to aspire to, but this is not something that you can hail Israel or a perpetrator before an international tribunal. This is a case that must be investigated and prosecuted at the local level. And the international community only gets involved when there are higher levels, higher issues of international law involved. And as tragic and appalling as the death of Abu Akleh was, and as tragic and appalling is, the violence that we're seeing across Israel and across the Middle East, often perpetrated in hate, this is still something that needs to be investigated and prosecuted and dealt with at a local level. It's not something that normally raises to the specter of the international community. So it's somewhat of a false distinction to keep talking about international law and how it applies when it doesn't. This is this is an internal matter. This is a matter for Israel. It's a matter for the Palestinian Authority to investigate. It's not a matter for the International Criminal Court or for the United Nations to hold court on what is happening.
And as we're nearing the end of our discussion now, ladies and gentlemen, you've all alluded to it during our conversation. In our time and age, when, the battle of narrative is being determined at such an early stage, is there even room or relevance to any proper, quote-unquote, traditional investigation? Inon?
Well, I think, again, we are now fighting a battle, which is a battle for consciousness, which is being decided in the media, in the social media. And it's a battle that, Israel cannot win because we are outnumbered. But, in order to win and change the direction, I think that the first step that we need to do, we need to tell the international forces, whether they are pro or anti-Israel for sure, not to involve in our conflict and what's happening in our land, and take responsibility and sovereignty over all of our land, and to do it gradually, Be'ezrat Hashem.
Isabella, your final remarks?
So I'm pretty sure murdering 3 Jews last week with an axe was against international law, but it seems as though international law, international inquiries aren't applied evenly when it comes to Israel. So my final remark on this would be that if we're going to talk about international law and inquiries, we need to apply it evenly, and I think that we shouldn't, just give up and put up a white flag and say Israel will never win the war of international law, or ideologically that we should push forward, and facts and truth will always prevail. And I think that begins with owning our story, and I think this reflects a greater problem, that the enemies of Israel will always use any tool, whether it be international law, to leverage their hate or their bias against Israel. I've heard of the term Mizrahi washing, or adding washing to anything else. My family fled Morocco and came to Israel and was saved by Israel. So when we see international law being leveraged, it's a claim that's pretty much recycled, and I think we should keep that in mind when speaking about this.
Last but definitely not least, Gerard, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. A lot of this has to do with upholding and defending the civil and human rights of the Jewish community worldwide, in Israel and around the world. And you don't do that by being on the defensive. You do that by mobilizing, by changing the narrative, and by focusing on how we uphold our rights, not how do we defend against false attacks and false narratives. A lot of that is making our voices heard, is amplifying the demand to end Jew hatred by joining civil rights movements that fight for the Jewish people, that are of the Jewish people. That's what we need to do in order to change the narrative. That's why movements like the End Jew Hatred movement are so crucial to this effort, because the narrative is perverted and people are using a tragic death in one place, in one part of the world, to instigate the murder of hundreds of thousands more. And that cannot be allowed to happen.